Yes, hello. So welcome everyone to the fourth session of these Wild Talks as part of the program of the exhibition Wild Care, Architectures of Love and Correspondence that Ana Jara and I are curating within this year's Porto Design Biennale. And I just want to start thanking the whole team of the Biennale, led by Alastair, Magda and Raquel, who are of course behind the possibility of us having this series of talks. But also especially to Sarah and Ines that are making things possible in both production and organization and have been incredibly helpful in arranging everything for this conversation to take place. We started the series with a fantastic encounter and conversation with Pedro Costa, which was possible physically in Porto during the opening week of the exhibition. And this was followed by online talks with Sofia Neuparth and Marco Casagrande in the past 2 weeks. And this week, we are really excited and delighted to welcome Jack Halberstam, whose work is not only beautifully groundbreaking and completely wild, but also one of the primary references and inspirations for this exhibition and curatorial project, as well as some interventions and previous work leading to it. So it's both an honor and really exciting to get to share a while with him to discuss, hopefully to discuss a few things, wild things, destitution, unmaking, unlearning, ways of unmaking the world we inhabit, in his own words. It's just too bad that in the end we are not being able to carry out this encounter in real life as we really thought that it was possible and planned for, but we are still very excited that we can have it somehow. Just a few words. I don't want to make it too long, but I think it's important to introduce properly. Jack Halberstam is Professor of Gender Studies and English at Columbia University, and the author of at least 7 or 8 books, many books, including Skin Shows, Female Masculinity in a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Trans Asterisk, Quick and Quirky Account of Gender Violence, and his most recent Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. And without further ado, I just want to give the word to Jack and welcome him. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you so much to both you and Ana for inviting me. Yes, I wish we could have been in person. It would have been so amazing to share the space with the exhibition that you've created. And to make the images do a certain kind of work for us. But, one of the advantages of Zoom is just that it creates a kind of access point for people who can't be together in a location. And so I'm happy tonight to share this space with you. So, because I haven't seen the exhibit yet, I'm just going to try to talk through the category of wildness with you. And as I said to Alberto before we began, I really, don't simply want to come in and define wildness for us all and lead a discussion. I really want to engage the work that has already happened to create this exhibit, to put in motion certain ideas about architecture, about space, about desire, about political will, and the ways in which architecture both constrains us and offers routes of escape from the mundane and banal articulations of the political that we tend to live with. And what I see behind this exhibit, the pieces of it that I can access, is a desire to find within the non-human world, the structures that we live with and that we inhabit, to find new articulations of the body, of being, of knowing, and of undoing. So let me just say, I'll just say a little bit about my work to try to situate it within this exhibit, an exhibit that as I'm trying to propose is offering us a political alternative, and a political alternative that draws its vocabulary not from the usual sources, but looks to wild poetry, looks to forgotten art movements, looks to strange associations and solidarities for a clue about how to undo the logics of global capitalism, something like that, okay? So when I started doing my work on wildness, honestly, to be totally honest, I thought that I was going to take the category of the wild, turn it into a vector for resistance and rebellion, and make some claims on the category of anarchy. And I thought it would be quite simple to do. And I thought in a way that anarchy awaited me in this category of wildness. But actually, wildness has its own plans. That's what I want to say from the outset, is that you don't do things with wildness. Wildness does things with you. And so whatever kind of intention one might enter the space of wildness with, that intention will quickly dissolve into a multitude of paths and pathways, byways and trajectories. And I quickly ran into trouble with trying to direct the flow of traffic through the terrain of wildness. And before I knew it, I was in a book where I had sort of reproduced in some ways the terms of the colonial encounter that divides the world up into the civilized and the disorderly, or the domestic and the wild. So one of the things that I think that this book, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, is trying to do is both offer a description of the theoretical terrain of wildness, but also acknowledge how difficult it is to work with a category of disorder, right? Because it isn't just a matter of harnessing wildness, plugging it into your political project, and then go off with it to, change the world. It just doesn't work that way. And I have a couple of examples of that I want to share with you today, so that we can see that wildness always cuts both ways. Wildness can be the force of resistance, but it can also be the return of the colonial. Wildness can be the things that resist, the things that escape, but wildness can also be the normative swallowing you up again. So let's see how that works in a few examples, and then see what we want to do with this when we return to the exhibit in, say, 10 minutes or so. So let me just see if I can share my screen with you. Okay, here we go. And let me just put it into play mode so it looks better. There we go. Okay, so like you guys, I started thinking about certain non-human forces of disorder, at least in part through the work of Gordon Matta Clark. And Gordon Matta Clark's fantastic interventions into architecture under the heading of an architecture, again, offer a different vocabulary. So instead of thinking with the propulsive language of making and doing and being, Matta Clark offers the language of nothing, of dismantling, unmaking, undoing, unbuilding, cutting, slashing, working with and through space, the void. So rather than a building, Matta Clark constructs empty space or negative space, and then asks us to think about this negative space in relationship to the massive architectures of modernity. The other, the trajectory, if you like, of this project as it will unfold in my second volume of Wild Things, has to do with collapse. And here I turn to the work of people like Alvin Baltrop, who was a gay Black photographer who did take photographs of gay men having sex in the piers on the west side of New York City in the 1970s, when the city was sort of crumbling to the ground. Yes, he did take pictures of those, of the men who were cruising in those areas. But more than anything, his photographs capture the downward spiral of collapse. And that's kind of where my project goes next, is to think about the organic shapes that form out of the, when the roof has fallen in, when the girders have fallen down, when the structure is not supported, when decay has set in, when a building begins a kind of graceful spiral down. That collapse is also wild, and it has its own intention, it has its own agency, and it is in some form an architecture. So I want us to, in the future work that I'm doing, I try to think with these unravelings of buildings rather than the making of them. Okay, but in the book, as I said, I work through a number of case studies that first offer you the seduction, if you like, of rebellion, as Maurice Sendak's fabulous book, Where the Wild Things Are, does, but then just as quickly returns you to the colonial order. And that's what happens a lot with wildness. And I actually want to offer that today as a topic of discussion for us, to the curators of wild architectures of care, to say, are there spaces in your own exhibit where you try to use this category only to find that you will return to the same neoliberal metrics, or some of the languages that you were hoping to contest find their way back in. So if you're wondering, well, what does that look like? Well, say in Where the Wild Things Are, we do have wild things, and we do have a wild rumpus, and we do have a children's story where a little seeker rejects the family home and goes out into the world and finds another space of possibility. But he also he's also made king of the wild things. He also becomes a sovereign subject in the space of the wild things. And he also finds a group of creatures who are wild, but also ruined, but also despairing. And this really comes out in the movie made by Spike Jonze of Where the Wild Things Are. And what's more, like all colonial destroyers, little Max comes to Where the Wild Things Are. He has a good time. He enjoys being the sovereign subject. And there you see him with a little crown on his head. But he also leaves. He leaves and he has changed nothing. And maybe he has even intensified the isolation and the alienation of the wild things. So there's a colonial narrative of return that haunts Where the Wild Things Are, and that speaks to a kind of rebellious instinct in childhood, but reminds us that the wildness of the child is all too quickly transformed into the conformity of the adult. And here's just a couple of panels from Where the Wild Things Are. And in one, you see the confusion that makes Where the Wild Things Are so charming, the confusion in the panel on the left, where Max is taking on the subjectivity of the wild. He's in a wolf's costume, and he's chasing an animal, but the animal is a domesticated dog of the family home. The animal itself is not wild, right? And then on the wall, there's a drawing of a wild thing and an authorial signature by Max. And then in a further layer of complexity, Max holds in his hand a fork, so that he's chasing the dog, he's becoming wolf, but the dog, rather than being his playmate, is potentially his food. And so there's a sort of scrambling of all of these classifications of animal, human, mimicry, costume, domesticated creature, wild creature, artist, subject, object, pet, food. All of these things are sort of tangled up in those opening panels that are so wonderful. But order returns in the solemnity of the second panel on the right, where Max, the little human in the world of the wild, has been made into a king. And he's still wearing his wolf's costume, but he's also wearing the crown. And so you could say that the book is aware, allegorically, is aware of the dangers of wildness, and yet plays back into the hands of the colonial formulation of wildness, all at the same time. So when we work with wildness, and I'm going to keep repeating this, we on the one hand access a portal of rebellion, and on the other hand, we confirm the coordinates of colonial rule. And we do it all in the same space. And that makes the wild a very dangerous space to be. Okay. The second case that I want to give you of exactly this kind of scrambling of rebellion and conformity, I take up in the first chapter of the book, which is sort of this, it comes after the introduction. And it is the narrative, you know, and Alberto sent me some of the material from the exhibit. And in the material about the exhibit, the curators say, we want to tell stories, you know, we want to tell stories about these wild architectures of care. And in many ways, that's all that I'm doing in Wild Things. I'm telling stories about people like Max, like this figure, Roger Casement, who go into the wild, who are seduced by the wild, but who end up being vectors for colonial inscription, however much they may be resisting that role. And here's case study number 2, if you like. And it's funny because I heard about this guy, Roger Casement, an Irish diplomat from the late, who was really very active in the late 19th century in the Belgian Congo, and in Brazil, I believe, in the Putumayo region. He was a diplomat. He was an Irish nationalist. And I heard about him when a gay colleague presented about Roger Casement and presented him as a kind of gay martyr who was vilified when his sexuality came to light, who did all of this great work as a diplomat, arguing for the human rights of colonized people in the Putumayo region and in the Congo, went into these places, saw the violence committed against indigenous groups by English, Belgian, Dutch, Portuguese colonizers, and tried hard to set up a kind of human rights framework within which the colonizers would be prosecuted and penalized. And in that part of Roger Casement's work, he seems to be an anti-colonial figure. And the colleague that I heard presenting on him was really like presenting him as a martyr, because when his gayness came to light, and I'll tell you the circumstances under which it did, he was vilified, he was prosecuted by the British government, and he was eventually hung. And I want to tell you how that came about. So after he returns from the Congo in 1913, Casement comes back to Ireland on the verge of World War I. And he actually made a connection with the German government and said to the Germans, you know, on behalf of Ireland, he says, Ireland is the Congo of Europe. It is the colonized heart of Europe. And I want Ireland to join forces with the Germans against the British to bring down this imperial structure, right? So far, so good. So the Germans just promptly turn him in to the British. The British put him in jail. The Irish begin to agitate on his behalf. He's a nationalist hero now. And then the British bring forward these diaries, which are now called the Black Diaries. And in his diaries that he kept while he was a diplomat in the Congo and in the Putumayo region, he talked about paying for sex with Black and brown young men. And in the diaries, he kept meticulous records of the kind of sex he had with those men, how long the men, what the size was of the men's genitalia, how they looked physically. And then he would go on to talk about what he ate for dinner. So at the same time that he's agitating on behalf of colonized peoples, he's sexually fetishizing Black and brown boys in a way that Eng Beng Lim has written about in a book about colonial fetishism. My gay colleague who was presenting this work had nothing to say about this fetishistic relationship to Black and brown bodies, in which Casement was on the one hand saying, this is outrageous, the violence of colonialism, and on the other hand, dipping his hand into the honeypot of colonial sexuality. He's no different in that respect from the colonial memsabs in India or in Brazil or in the Dutch colonies, in the Portuguese colonies, who were raping, plundering, and sexually assaulting indigenous men and women. And so here we have, there it is again, the ambiguous subject at the heart of wildness. And in fact, casement is often linked to Joseph Conrad, who was in the same regions he was at the same time. And Conrad's book, The Heart of Darkness, is the canonical statement on the ambivalence and ambiguity of wildness as it appears within the colonial regime. And so in The Heart of Darkness, you can't tell in that novel, is this a critique of England? You know, and remember that haunting phrase, this too has been one of the dark places of the world, which is a reference to London, okay? Is Heart of Darkness a critique of British colonialism? Is it a damning representation, or is it its confirmation? And the fact that we can't decide tells us that we're in the category of the wild, okay? So that's also wildness. And here's just one of those 19th century portraits of Roger Casement. Here he's situated in relationship to a spectacularly rendered colonial image of a Black woman. But of course, this is a heterosexualization of Casement's actual sexual interest in the so-called wild spaces that he traveled. So here, these are the kinds of claims that then I make in the book, that wildness is not exhausted by its colonial function within civilizational discourse, but it's difficult to work with it because it keeps returning us there, okay? But also that wildness is a discursive force that underpins the order of things with a necessary disorder of things. And here, just to say, a disorder of things can be anarchy and can be the kinds of solidarity projects that you highlight in your exhibit. But a disorder of things can also be the disorder of capitalism reasserting itself through new channels of appropriation. So the category that I turn to next is the category of bewilderment. And really what I've been talking about so far is the way in which, when you try to use the category of the wild, you end up in a space of bewilderment. And in the English vocabulary, bewilderment is a fantastic word because it suggests a becoming wild, but also a becoming lost, but also a not knowing. If you're bewildered, you just don't know. And that's my experience of working with wildness. But there are people who've managed to harness bewilderment in really productive ways. And I'm just going to give you an example of that in the work of Kent Monkman. And Kent Monkman is an indigenous, a First Nations Canadian Swampy Cree artist who practices out of Toronto. He paints massive scale paintings in the style of 19th century Western portraiture, mostly painted by white men who encountered indigenous people and then rendered them in these very romantic depictions. Kent Monkman has literally repainted the colonial encounter from the perspective of the indigenous artist. And in this image that I have up on the screen, this is a detail from a larger painting called Trappers of Men. And this is what I mean by bewilderment when it's in the hands of an indigenous practitioner, as opposed to bewilderment as it is a force of confusion, the confusion that I've been describing thus far. So in the hands of an indigenous artist, bewilderment can be a weapon of the weak, if you like, in the mode that James Scott uses it. In this painting, you see Jackson Pollock catching Mondrian Okay, again, this is what Monkman does. He kind of, and he's been critiqued for this, for trucking with high modernism. You know, so it's a scene of encounter between indigenous people, and you see these representations of indigenous people. You have a animal skin stretched out on the ground, and a native artist painting on the animal skin, and making sort of these marks, just you know, somewhat random marks. So Pollock captures Mondrian, who's making his characteristic grid on the painting, and the paintbrush splatters paint onto the animal skin. And you can see Pollock going, aha, right? This is what I'm going to do. But the joke here is that Pollock, who Western art history believes to be the original figure of abstract expressionism, is in fact just somebody who's copying and borrowing and appropriating indigenous art. Okay, so this is very characteristic of Monkman, that he repaints a Western painting, but shows that high modernism is merely a bad reflection of indigenous cultural production. And the other site that I look to and I developed, and I won't do that here today, but Rite of Spring, which is one of these fantastic, bewildering texts that people don't know what to do with, is it's one of the cornerstones of high modernism, but it's also a primitivist text, both in the symphony by Stravinsky, but also in the ballet by Nijinsky, in which Russian artists try to imagine what an indigenous fertility rite would look like. And in the process, they break the format of modern ballet. And so the Rite of Spring was seen as an abomination when it was first performed in 1913, right around the time, by the way, that Roger Casement was on trial for his crimes in a court in England. 1913, Rite of Spring is performed in Paris, and the crowd is bewildered and doesn't know what to make of this awkward ballet in which the dancers don't leap gracefully across the stage. They jump up and down in place. They don't point their toes. They turn them in a kind of, in this awkward stance, and they dance themselves to the point of exhaustion. But in a way, and here's an example of the Joffrey Ballet's recreation of this very, very queer ballet that was written, choreographed by Nijinsky, that was managed by Diaghilev, that was scored by Stravinsky, and all of these men were sexually involved with each other at the time that they were making this art, and they thought that they were drawing on these folk traditions, and in the end, the folk traditions overwhelm the modernist text, and it becomes this incredible, jarring, chaotic encounter of the modern and the traditional. That, to come back to, I'm not going to show you the piece here, but to come back to Monkman returns to Rite of Spring with this tool of bewilderment and decides that he's going to restage Rite of Spring from an indigenous perspective, offering us a critique also of George Caitlin's painting, Dance to the Badash from 1891. And so here he is, here's Kent Monkman in his alter ego performance self, reperforming the Dance of the Badash to a piece of music created by an indigenous Canadian musician and based upon Stravinsky's original score for Rite of Spring. And that's what I mean by bewilderment, where bewilderment isn't just getting lost in the colonial order of things, but bewilderment is literally the indigenous figure speaking back to this appropriative act on the part of both high modernism and colonial culture. Okay, let me just wind down then by moving on to the second half of the book, which is basically about the relationship between the human and the animal. And in the chapters at the end of the book, I'm basically making a very simple argument. And that argument is that while we believe, we, Western culture, in particular, Euro-American cultures in a specific way, believe that, you know, the animal must be saved and the animal must be lived with and the animal must be domesticated, and that the best relationship to the wild is conservation on the one hand and domestication on the other. In the middle of the last century, there's an incredible gay seam of books, a gay genre of books that are all written by gay or oddly sexualized men who announce their desire for wild birds, okay? And that relationship to the wild that does not seek to domesticate or to conserve is what I advocate for. I try to think with a desiring relationship to the wild that is not about the pet, but that is better captured in these kinds of narratives. And these are not well-known texts at all. The Peregrine is a kind of love poem to the peregrine, written by an odd guy who is a naturalist, a British guy who wandered the countryside for 10 years following peregrine hawks, and writes a poem saying that he wants to be a hawk and he wants to be part of this mating pair. Then in the Pilgrim Hawk, Glenway Westcott writes a story about a gay man who stands watching is in part of a drama in which a married couple arrive at a country house carrying a hawk, and he identifies with the hawk against the married couple. And A Kestrel for a Knave is about a young boy growing up in England who captures a kestrel and tries to train it, and its inability to be trained offers him a kind of route out of his working class existence, and the alternatives are either going into the mine and doing hard labor or becoming bourgeois. For him, the kestrel represents some other pathway. Then I look at this book, H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald, which was a big sensation a couple of years ago. And in that book, she talks about her own relationship to a wild bird that she tries to tame and does tame. But in the process, she reflects back on another gay book, The Goshawk by T.H. White, in which T.H. White writes at length about his inability to train a goshawk, and in the process about his falling in love with this goshawk. Okay. And I'll let you read in the book about, the claims that I want to make about these kooky sort of gay men, but are they gay, or are they people whose main attraction is actually to wildness? And if it is, what does that mean? What do we take away from that? Against that kind, and here's a great quote from T.H. White, in which he explains what the desire for the wild is. And he uses the word feral. He says the word feral had a kind of magical potency which allied itself with two other words, ferocious and free. Fairy, fae, aerial, and other discreditable alliances ranged themselves behind the great chord ferox. So ferox is the Latin word for fierce, ferocious, or wild. And look at the words that he's paired ferox with: fairy, fae, and aerial. I mean, these are gay words. I mean, in a contemporary world, fairy is a word for an effeminate gay man. Fae is a word used almost exclusively for gay men, but it also means the agitation that a body goes through on the point of death. And then aerial suggests a sort of otherworldliness. What if we use these words oriented towards wildness, to describe desires, languages for desires, modes of desire that have nothing to do with the homo-hetero binary, but that are oriented towards a kind of wild nature that cannot be brought into human domestication. Okay, and then the last chapter of the book suggests what goes horribly wrong when, instead of pursuing the wild through these this return to the ferox, we instead try to incarcerate the animal in the category of the pet. And this, by the way, is the chapter that makes people really mad, just in case you were already getting fired up to defend your little pet. You can, by all means, have a pet. By all means, love your dog, love your budgie, love your kitty cat. But don't imagine that being in relationship to these domesticated animals means being in a non-human relation. Those animals are scripted according to your life, according to your routines, according to your habits. They are stuck within your household. They are not wild. They do not bring wildness into the household. Instead, they give us an example of the way in which we cannot, as humans, seemingly be in relationship to the wild without wanting to tame it. So in the end, the question that the book asks is there another way of being in relationship to the wild that is not appropriative, that is not embedded in these racialized narratives about Black people and Indigenous people, that is not a sort of self-congratulatory narrative about how well the human does when it comes to conservation and animal-human bonds, but that really thinks about wildness as a space of non-human, anti-human, and human activity, unhuman, inhuman, all of those things, and that is willing to encounter wildness on its own terms as opposed to on our terms. And if so, and this is my question for Wild Architectures of Care at the Porto Design Biennale, what politics follow from that engagement with the wild? And I will stop there with this image of world unbuilding, again, an image of collapse, an image that is no longer, we now will not read as just a gay image, but an image that wants to understand the wildness of a world coming undone all around us because of us, in spite of us, and possibly against us. And let me stop sharing my screen, and I will stop with that image.
Yes, thank you very much, and wow, it's always impressive, but it's also in a way a little bit overwhelming, because you have to also understand that we are not English speakers. We are always,
I know, I'm sorry, yeah,
incredibly limited by our kind of inability to kind of, well, we just have to just work with our broken English, and then we feel that of course we are never in the same register, even though of course we try our best, no, but we have to
remember, Alberto, the problem is my
here.
Problem, because I am the monolingual speaker. So we speak in whatever frame we can, and my apologies.
We just try. I think it's beautiful to encounter also this kind of breadth and depth, and the way in which sometimes words are like broken up and show and illustrate and communicate beautiful ideas, and I can't agree more, like the way that you've been putting some things up. So I try to respond to a few things,
okay,
and then hopefully maybe also give you a beginning of an answer to this question that you're posing, which I think is extremely difficult, but we can try at least to say something. I am really in love with this thing that you were saying of wildness having its own plans, and the way in which you cannot do things with wildness, but wildness is going to do things to you or with you. That this is really the case. I think that every time I have tried, I have experienced this kind of trouble that you get into and that you have to deal with. So this is really I think really well put and well captured, and I completely agree. The way in which this has two sides. So we are always, you were saying, accessing a portal of rebellion, or a kind of portal of rebellion, but also confirming the coordinates or the place of coloniality or colonialism, and that's a risk. No? At the same time, I believe very much in this idea that violence is not exhausted in those risks, but that there is this power of thinking beyond this, maybe constraint or limits which have been in a way imposed to this concept, to the concept itself, rather than to the things that actually this word is supposed to kind of be referring to or dealing with. I think with the question that you were posing about what kinds of examples we have in the exhibition that have also thrown us back into this feeling of Max becoming the king of the wild things, and therefore leaving the wild things in almost a worse place than they were. This kind of colonial return. I think this is the case, and it happens a lot within architecture. I think because of architecture's extreme conservatism and connections, like deeply embedded connections with the forces and the powers that be and that shape the world. So there's all of these architectural firms and design design in a way stamps or brands, which almost all architects need to kind of in a way develop and work with. So even sometimes when there is a kind of idea of engaging with this wild approach or less disciplinary approach, and we were having this last week a little bit maybe with Marco Casagrande and his ideas about ruining, and I feel like sometimes some of these examples become a kind of image or a kind of method or a kind of routine that needs to be reproduced, and that therefore becomes a recipe or becomes something close to a recipe. And I don't want to criticize Marco because I really like his work, so it's not a question of his example, but I think that there's moments in which some of these engagements, in a way, partly because of the constraints of the profession, become a trap and become also a method which I also link to colonialism, in the sense that method presupposes transportation to another place without taking into account situatedness in an appropriate sense of what kind of way or a mode would be. So that's one way in which I think we have encountered that problem. And then more into the difficult question that you're posing, I don't think I can answer, or I am capable of answering that, but I think that there's something of a kind of clue or a direction which I'm particularly very interested in, which is these three words. I was trying to clarify something that we write in the curatorial text with those three words: hold, attention, and relay, which for me have to do with wildcare in a very precise way, and they have to do with improvisation and with openness and with engagement. So there's the idea of us being held in place with this body-to-body relationship with the world, and hold in a way can be a very negative term that says that we are like stuck, or like in the hole that Moten talks about, the hole of the boat, of the slavery ships. But holding can also be a really nice thing, in the sense of holding someone, or so holding each other, or helping someone stay afloat. And I think that is to do with the way in which we pay attention to things, which is what I feel care is interesting for me about, and how can we substitute this being trapped in that body-to-body relationship with the world with an attention that is open to relays which come not only from human things, but they come from other kinds of life forms, as a kind of improvisation, as a kind of dance, as a kind of a dance of engagement, which is capable of just producing something which was not planned, or which was not preconceived or managed in advance to fulfill a kind of precise purpose, but it is just like flowing as it goes, as it happens in maybe jazz or dance improvisation. So that's my only kind of contribution, potential contribution to this question of yours, which I think is really difficult. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, thank you, Alberto. That actually is really great as a response. And the piece that I really didn't engage with is care, which you referenced in your comments, in terms of like this engagement that is about holding, like holding space for each other, and maybe even holding each other, you know, as a kind of like a desire to enter into connections that are more than just a kind of politically savvy, you know, set of dynamics among people, but that are also structured through actual concern. The problem is that care itself is one of these tricky categories to work with. And I recently was invited to another event, very different from this one, that was structured around love and care. And I had to be the kind of, you know, the contrarian who said no to care, precisely because in my book, the care piece comes up in relationship to the pets, where, you know, caring is an alibi for some of the worst kinds of enclosures, really, you know, and the reason that I use the category of the pet is precisely because it's in relationship to the pet that the human believes themselves to be most caring, you know, and you can see this in the way people talk about their dogs and their cats, that they're so sure that their concern for the animal proves what good people they are, when in fact the concern for the animal comes from a place of incarceration as much as anything, you know. So I don't know, it's care is one of these tricky categories. It's very human centric. Animals often don't care, and their care is expressed in very different ways. So I think that even when I got your invitation, Alberto, I was like concerned about this particular category, like wild architecture, I can do those, but care, I have questions about, you know?
Yeah, I completely like understand these questions. When we had the invitation, actually it was Ana that was getting the invitation from Alastair's Look, that is the chief curator of the PDV, and his proposal was that we should do an exhibition on matters of caring, which was part of this alter realities, which is the general theme for the exhibition for the PDV this year. And our response was precisely to try to find a way in which we could interrogate or problematize this idea of caring, which we had been working with before, and which we also found complicated and troublesome in various ways, and not the least kind of troubling of which has to do with a very kind of managerial or administrative way of conceiving care as a kind of medical protocol that needs to be somehow transferred to certain kind of populations or things, and I think that, and also many other kind of non-transformative uses of care, and we thought that having your wild things in mind, that we could think precisely of forms of care and intimacy that are not always necessarily human, and that do not respond to protocols of administration and delivery, but they are more emerging within situations out of this holding each other, and in a way very, very close to this notion of Otkin that Haraway also speaks about, where you just engage and start caring or start minding what's happening to something or someone else that is close to you, just because you are there and because of the intensity of this intimacy, and not because of any kind of protocols or administration or management or anything. And in that space, then care or wild care, because of course we want to kind of change care by saying wild care, then becomes a possibility of being close and being holding, and being attentive to these relays or to these potentials for relays. So I'm listening, therefore I want to be in tune, therefore I'm going to be attentive to any relays that you might send, and then I'm not sure what I'm going to do with them, like in a jam, music or dance jam, someone does something and you don't know what you're going to do with it, but it touches you if you are attentive, and then you do something with it, and then you continue the dance or you play along. And I think that in that sense, that's the way I want to think about care, and that we are trying to put some examples in the exhibition which we think that are doing that architecturally or spatially or design wise. Yeah, but I'm sorry, I think I'm saying too many things.
Anna, did you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think we try to take care out of this enclosure that normally is very problematic, and we took the decision to go for the space of the wilderness in the sense of becoming very specific about some kinds of relations that we wanted to capture, and the exhibition itself it's a lot as this shape. So I think we could manage to take out the exhibition of a space of also being an exhibition that is showing, but an exhibition that is becoming. And you also talk about this, like I was strangely, this presentation is fitting the kind of form we gave to the exhibition. You didn't visit the exhibition, but it's things take their own shape. So, and people that are watching, visiting, and also produce this shape of this wild care. So we were more concerned about what kind of problems, what kind of situations, what kind of spaces, like you told us, ambiguous, in between portals, can we have, how many portals can we have? I think the stories are also very, are portals, are myths, are books, are situations where people produce spaces and architectures that are not currently seen as something. They are just there waiting, and we took the decision of capturing this. Also, I think this is a space of instability that is also rarely taken into views. So also a lot about your work was passing through us. We were assuming this space of instability, of somehow unbearableness in some cases, I think. You don't know, like you said, you don't know.
You don't know, exactly. And I think in a world scripted by Twitter fights and Facebook posts and fake news and political systems that are basically just capitalism, it's so refreshing, right, to be in an exhibit where everything doesn't add up, everything doesn't make sense, where things have been set in motion with the hopes that something will emerge, but you don't know in advance what it will be. And that's what I kind of hope for your exhibit, that it isn't clear what the outcome should be. Like sometimes when I present this work, people are like, well, what are the wild politics? How do we sign on to them? And what do we need to do? And it's like, but what if we didn't think like that about the political or even about space, architecture becoming? What if we, as Alberto was saying, we stage the possibility for conversations, knowing that some of them will dead end, some of them will be amazing and open something up, and others will return us to the status quo. And I think you have to be prepared for all of those things, but take the risk of making those spaces happen. So are there any questions from our audience? Or it's so weird. This is why we didn't want to do Zoom, right? Because
It's difficult.
We don't know to whom are we speaking? Is anybody out there? Hello,
we can try to ask the PDB if they can gather some of the questions in that might be coming from through the YouTube channel, and
I think
hopefully that could be.
Yeah. I think as usual we don't have any questions. This is also weird. I think the conversations are well enough to sustain themselves in a position where they are already. I think the wild talks are becoming kind of question more than answers itself in itself.
That's fine. That's totally fine.
Yeah. But I might have a question in it. It is dealing with this idea of, I mean, we are both architects. Architecture is a lot about constructing. When we took the wilderness, the wild, we were. It was a lot about unmaking, dismantling. The things, and my question is more or less like kind of I'm concerned with how can we put this space of ambiguity and of and making into motion in a way of building reality. I think what Alberto said, like architecture is building relations, is building reality. Even when we look at the space of colonialism, I mean, we are both, let's say, me and Jack, in Lisbon. Lisbon is a colonial city, is an imperial city. It has a lot of this structure still. I can try to make a very short comment. It has been for 500 years a space of that was created as a center of colonial space. So it still has a lot of this in the way it was built, in its urbanism, even in the way the colonization was made and the people returned to Lisbon. So there is, since the 70s, peripheries that were created like as a metropolis. And one question I have is a lot about how can we change this? How can we problematize, and how can we change besides the usual things that we think in these spaces, that we have to talk about things, rename things, but we also have to rebuild things. Yeah. Rebuild means that we have to take action into make a kind of an effort to see things in another way and try to build forward the world. So this is a question about the present, but also a question about the future. How can we foresee things in a different order, like with this disorder?
But honestly, Anna, I think we can't foresee things. I think that that is actually a mistake. Like, you know, in the new book that I'm working on, the second volume of Wild Things, I'm actually going back in time to the 70s, to the An-Architectural Group, to Alvin Baltrop's Photographs of Collapse, to autodestructive art, to people who were trying to contest the art moment, the art market, at the very moment that the art market was becoming this massive capital venture, you know. And I think it's instructive sometimes, instead of always pushing to go forward and to think about how can we do things differently next, to look back and remember all the incredible creative labor that has gone into trying to interrupt the present in earlier moments. And that's, you know, super appealing to me about the 70s was the way in which, you know, pre-internet, pre the fall of socialism, before the complete domination of global capitalism and speculative finance. I mean, not saying that those things weren't around in some form, but they weren't around in the form that they're in now. Cities looked really different, you know, whether it's in relationship to the fact that people squatted in abandoned buildings, which is very difficult in most cities to do now. You know, cities were falling apart. Buildings were made in very functional ways, as opposed to the luxury buildings that are being built now mostly as investments. Like this building that collapsed last week in Miami is a really interesting example, right? A really horrifying example of the way in which the building is just a holding place for capital investment. And it doesn't actually even hold people in the way that we were talking about a moment earlier. The structure is so flawed that these buildings are likely to collapse in ways that are not attractive in the way that I was talking about with the Alvin Baltrop photographs, but that are disastrous and violent and look like they're just accidents, but they are in fact the violence of the real estate market at work. So I think it's very hard to know what should come next, Anna, unless we have dismantled the conditions of the everyday, you know, that make up a common sense understanding of who we are and where we are and what we do.
Yeah, but can we use a desire to be connected to another kind of order that's perhaps more accurate?
Yeah.
That's
trying to figure that out. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I think that's the question. Okay.
I think we have some examples in the exhibition, which I really hope that you are going to be able to.
I'm going to try to go, believe me.
During the weekend.
Yes.
And in the direction precisely, I think, of engaging with the immediate and with the now, in a way also echoing the general theme of the PDV, which is this idea of nowness and the present. But I think that there's something really difficult within the discipline or the profession of architecture, which has to do with the way in which architecture is embedded in these techniques of projection and planning, which are that's what architecture does, no, in a way. Like that's what it has done almost always. Right. And all of the systems of supporting these projections and this planning, which rely a lot on drawing and techniques of drawing, and then some of the examples, for instance, they are based on experiences which completely reject drawing as a tool for architecture and utilize other mechanisms which have to do with the immediate and the performative and with engaging maybe with memories and a kind of archival practice, and then reconstituting them, but without drawings. And that alone, I think, is a quite rich kind of pool of cases and examples, questioning drawing, questioning projection, questioning planning mechanisms which are embedded in the profession and which lead sometimes to that kind of idea of just thinking about the future and not thinking about now. So I think there are examples like that. There are also examples in which we are attentive to people and groups and collectives that have been able to recruit non-human forces, non-human forms of life into architecture. We love the example of Alexander Brodsky's ice pavilion, where the frost is an element that is filling up the gaps of this metal grid and in the end making the walls. And that requires really almost no design. It's a little bit almost like Mata Clark's Nothing Works. Here, the nothing of the whole works as well, because it's what allows the frost to cling onto it and then make the wall, which I think is also like fantastic. And this guy Brodsky is almost not designing. No, he's just like attentive to the temperatures and the way in which the weather works there. and he's not almost not being an architect, no, and in that sense is about unbuilding and unmaking and learning architecture. So I hope some of those things could also like inspire in that sense.
Well, yeah, I think Alberto, I think you're so right that it's very difficult to think with architecture, because architecture is just, it's one of these very vexing disciplines that is so embedded, so embedded in capitalist projects. I mean, it's very difficult to think of architecture outside of a kind of capitalist intention. And so looking for these kinds of projects like an architecture or I mean, there are 1,000,001 kind of eco-architectural projects that many design firms themselves are invested in, that are, building temporary homes for homeless people, or offering you a wearable architecture or whatever, and it's very hard to find the architectural projects that are able to sit at odds with the discipline of architecture. I think that's what you're saying, and I think you're right. And I think, it's why, I push in this sort of an architectural direction. And the piece that you talked about with the ice, is it ice that's sort of growing in the spaces? Is that what the project is by, what's the guy's
project
name?
By Brodsky. Alexander Brodsky. Yeah, this is a metallic grid, and it's the ice that is filling up these gaps because they are very small, and it's very cold outside. It's 20 minus, and it's also humid. When the humidity comes, then this frost gets stuck in the grid, and then when it gets colder and colder, then it gets thicker and thicker, and in the end you can have quite an interesting climate inside, which is much less extreme than outside. When it's 25 minus and windy outside, and inside is only 15 and not windy, then you can have a cup of coffee inside. That's what he says. So it's really like a small architecture, but it's also an architecture, I think, of engagement with weather and with other things that are not just human.
Exactly. That's so interesting. What if the weather were not just this severe force that we're battling, but was a unscripted mechanism of the world with which one needs to think and cooperate. It's like, because humans just want to they want to predict the weather. I think here of Tim Morton's construction of weather as a hyper object, which I really, I don't love all of that book, but I do like thinking with these kinds of categories, like the hyper object, something that's either too big or too small for the human to control in any way. And the weather is something that we are in relationship to all the time. And I don't know if you've noticed, but it's increasingly seems difficult for people to even predict what the weather will be. And this whole fantasy of forecasting, it's a fiction, right? It's a fiction. You're standing in the rain and you're looking at your app and it says sunny and warm, So I like this. I've been reading this trilogy, a sci-fi trilogy by a Black science fiction writer, N.K. Jemisin, who has a trilogy called Broken Earth. And in it, the earth is literally protesting human presence. And in the form of earthquakes, the earth keeps throwing humans off of its own surface and keeps disrupting any kind of effort that humans have made to build things on the earth. So the earthquake will come and bring down the whole city. And there's a group of sort of specially gifted people who are able to control and vibe with the tremors. And those people, again, they're like the wild. You don't know if they're a force of good or a force of evil. They work with the earth sometimes and against it at other times. And I think these kinds of fictions, like the Broken Earth trilogy, are really, in a way, we shouldn't be looking simply for scientific answers to the question of what now, what next, but thinking in these speculative ways about how to reconceive of earth, brokenness, weather, control, eruption, virus, right? We're in the grips of a non-human entity that has managed to still human activity in ways that I'm sure we didn't think were possible even 2-3 years ago. So how many of these non-human forces are constantly at work around us, trying to blow planes out of the sky or trying to sweep away coastal developments, or, why can't we see intention and agency within so-called natural activities, right?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that's in some cases this is starting to be understood, or to be like worked with by certain spatial practitioners, and in some of these examples they take into account, or at least they recruit, or they welcome in some of these forces, and they acknowledge that they are there, and then they are not under the control of humans as we tend to believe, and they're a bit humble in their practices. One last thing, maybe, one last idea that I have at least to share, which is through one of the other cases, is to do with the immediate, which is also a kind of antidote or resistance to the projective mechanisms of architecture, which are always not so much for the immediate, but they are more for this future of control, or fiction of control. And with the immediate, I think that we also like question the discipline and the profession of architecture ways or methods. So there's this case I think is fantastic by Miket, Swedish group of queer feminist architects and designers, and the Champa Oke, which is kind of like struggle Oke, it's a kind of like mix between a karaoke and an activist tent, and the tent is actually a karaoke bar where you can sing, but it's also a place where you can learn about the history of spatial struggles in the city, and it's also a place where you can do things, where you can make things, we can learn to make things with others as you're singing or listening to the songs. That's one example which I think engages really, really beautifully with immediate, but also with the past of these histories. And that's so with an architecture which is present and has been successful and has been beautiful, but it's not about that. No, so it's not about the architecture, it's not the thing. And they have another project which almost dissolves entirely the architecture, which is the club scenes. In the club scenes, what they do is that they go back in the history of queer clubs in Sweden, and they reproduce these spaces for one night, for one session. So it's really like a staging of this club night, and they do it with incredible care for the historicity of certain things and details of how these clubs were, but also reinterpreting. And I think that one speaks a lot about the power of an instant to change lives. So how a night in those clubs for certain people in certain moments really meant everything, or meant really a lot, and how little, in a way, the architecture, the physical architecture of those clubs is contributing to it. Of course, there's a kind of atmosphere, and that's what Miket is capturing really well in these stagings, the atmosphere more than the architecture. So it's the architecture of love instead of the architecture of the building. And for me, that's this immediacy.
That's lovely. Yeah, I like that idea a lot. As somebody who wrote a lot about subcultures earlier in my career, I definitely think what you're saying, Alberto, holds true, that the architecture of the subcultural scene, of the club space, of the band playing to a small audience, had everything to do with creating a kind of atmosphere through the music, through touch, through dance, or whatever. But I also think that those spaces are gone in many ways, and that club culture has been turned into another site of, a commodified good time, where you have a DJ who's making hundreds of thousands of dollars and they tend not to be subcultural spaces anymore. Let's put it like that. You know, everything has been sort of taken up into these grand projects, these grand stadium size events, as opposed to the little clubs that people used to gather in before the internet, before this kind of utter regulation of space and entertainment and recreation. So I think we're trying to grapple with both the possibilities for interruption. We're looking back at historical examples where conditions were different. We're looking forward to see whether we can change and break out of the status quo. But we're also aware of the fact that the conditions nowadays turn every kind of ecstatic communion into another form of profit. And it remains to be seen as to whether we can build our way out of that, architecturally speaking, or whether we can unbuild our way out of it. And I think we don't know yet. But I really actually wanted to ask you more about that group, the Swedish collective. And I hope, you know, when I go to the exhibit, I can read more about them. And they sounded like people who I shared interests with, you know.
Yeah, you absolutely do. Yes, they are amazing.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I don't know, Anna, do you have any last comments to share? Should we finish here, or
yeah, I think we should, because it's time for this. They are wild but not wild enough so we can spend hours here, but well, it's a pleasure to have you, Jack, and let's hope we can meet and visit the exhibition. I think you'll like it. It's okay. About a lot about your
I plan right now. My plan is to go on Sunday, so let's see. It's open on Sunday, yeah?
I think so.
Yes. Yeah. We will arrange it.
Yes, we'll arrange it. Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you so much,
Jack, for your time.
Opening up your space to me for you know, thinking about my work in this incredible show. And I hope we can talk again in the future in real time when I've seen the show, and maybe there are other collaborations to come.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully,
Bye-bye. Thank you.